Monday, April 17th. I had to stop and think, what day of the week is it? This is the meeting of the Community Development Committee. Is there, if there are no objections, we're going to delete information item number 1 from the agenda. And if there are no objections, additions, deletions, anything else, we'll proceed with approval of the April 3rd, 2023 Community Development Committee meeting minutes. Is there a motion to approve?
Move approval.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to approve the minutes. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We don't have any items on the consent business section of the agenda. We're going to move to non-consent. And our first presentation is 2023-87, application to the Environmental Protection Agency's Carbon Pollution Reduction Grant Program. Lisa Barajas.
Thank you, Madam Chair, committee members. I'm Lisa Barajas, Executive Director of the Community Development Division. It's my pleasure to be before you this afternoon. I almost said this morning. It is not morning, but it's still bright out, so it's great. The item today before you is our request to apply to the EPA's Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that today, what this grant opportunity entails, some timelines associated with it, talk to you about why would we even consider doing this work. Its alignment with regional planning efforts and some other efforts that you all are familiar with here at the Council, and then, of course, seeking your authorization to apply for that grant. So, Environmental Protection Agency earlier this year in February announced a notice of funding availability for this phase 1 of what they call our climate pollution reduction programs. This phase 1 program has $250 million available in non-competitive formula planning grants for both states and metropolitan statistical areas. States are $3 million amounts, so the state of Minnesota has already entered their application. The state timelines are a month earlier than the MSA timelines, metropolitan statistical areas. And then 67 of the largest metropolitan statistical areas in the nation are eligible for these $1 million planning grants, and the Twin Cities is one of those top 67. The purpose of the grant, this entire program, is really to encourage states, agencies, municipalities, tribes, and other local governments really to be working together to create comprehensive pathways for reducing climate pollution within their jurisdictions and within their areas of operation, and especially for low-income and disadvantaged communities. The second phase of this, which I skipped over in the first round, which is kind of the big kahuna of it, I apologize. On the previous slide, phase 2, EPA will be making available $4.6 billion of funding in a competitive process for implementing the strategies and actions that are put together within these regional plans and state plans that they are providing non-competitive dollars for. So this will really, completing these planning grant elements will make all local jurisdictions within a plan's geography eligible to compete for those phase 2 rounds of funds. So kind of getting into those second 2 objectives there then, is that the EPA's intent is really to provide flexible planning resources to assess and prepare and deploy the second round to deploy resources both in the federal acts that are listed there, and there's quite a few, as you're familiar with, that have been passed over the last couple of years, as well as this additional set of funds that EPA has set aside. And further, their goal is to drive transformative and scalable decarbonization efforts, really looking at not just a handful of projects around the nation, but making a significant impact on greenhouse gas mitigation. So for MSA plans, you'll see that acronym in the slideshow throughout, because writing out and saying metropolitan statistical area is a bit of a mouthful and a handful. So MSA plans, in this case, are required to really have this focus around regional coordination and collaboration with local governments. We are to be identifying priority measures that can be implemented by all the collaborators and local governments within the region. A significant amount of stakeholder engagement is expected as part of this work. And really, there's a great opportunity here for us to be aligning both with the work that the state climate action framework has developed as a foundation for this, as well as the broad range of local climate planning efforts that have already been completed within this region. There are roughly 60 to 70 local comprehensive plans that already address climate in some fashion, some in much more complex and comprehensive manners than others. But still, we have a significant amount of local effort that has been already put into place, and this is an opportunity for us as a region to really pull all of that together and create some shared goals, as well as a region to be able to compete for these additional federal dollars that will be made available in the coming years. And finally, this effort would really inform and connect to the 2050 Regional Development Guide, and I'll get into that a little bit further in my presentation. We have a short timeline for grant application. Our notice of intent to participate, which is really just a letter saying, hey, we're interested, is due on April 28th, with our full application, which includes our work plan and budget, due by the end of May. EPA has set a timeline of negotiating grant agreements with everybody by summer. We don't know if that means beginning of summer or end of summer, but summer. And that's quite a few with the 67 plus the 50 states and 4 territories that are eligible to apply. That's a lot of grant agreements for them to put into place. So I appreciate summer being the timeline there. And then by late 2023, EPA will be issuing their notice of funding opportunity for that phase 2 round of grants. So we really would have only had a short time frame of having our own grant in hand before seeing this opportunity for implementation coming out right around the corner. And then those applications being due for the phase 2 round in the first quarter of 2024. So I've been referencing the MSA, and in case you didn't have that geography memorized, it's actually a 15-county MSA, which changes with each of our census each decade. The U.S. Census Bureau defines this using my definition, I guess, that they apply each 10 years. And so our 15-county MSA includes those 2 counties in Wisconsin, St. Croix and Pierce County, as well as additional counties, the 5 to the north, Wright, Sherburne, Mille Lacs, Asante, and Chisago, and then Le Sueur to the south. We've been having a significant number of conversations with jurisdictions across this entire geography because the EPA's direction is that you should do your best to create a regional plan and work together. Like I said earlier, their goal is to support regional collaboration and interjurisdictional cooperation. So we've been spending a lot of time meeting with jurisdictions across the region, learning about their interest and what role they might want to play in this work, and how it relates to work that they might have already done, especially since a number of communities have already done that. So there's a list here for you just to give you a taste of the number of different communities that we've met with already, in different meetings that we've had been a part of, as well as some upcoming scheduled meetings that we have with additional folks in Wisconsin, as well as additional MSA counties. We've had a lot of email conversation, but really wanting to have some more conversations as we're working through how folks want to participate in this process. One thing that we did learn, and we've been working really closely with our colleagues at the Pollution Control Agency who are leading the state's effort on the state plan for this particular planning grant. In our collaboration with them and talking with Environmental Protection Agency staff is that there really is no wrong door to enter into this work. Communities who maybe might choose to not participate in the MSA plan, let's say, for example, Le Sueur is like, I'm good, I don't need to participate with you, they'd still be covered under the state's plan, and they would still be eligible to compete with for that phase 2 round of EPA funds. So we've been really taking that approach in partnership with our PCA colleagues on, just sharing the broad opportunities and really following the lead of what our colleagues in other counties might be interested in, what role they'd like to play in this work. So deliverables, getting down to the meat of the action here. The first deliverable is due in March of next year, and it's essentially the first draft of a climate action plan. They call it the Priority Climate Action Plan, and it needs to focus on both including an inventory, but also identifying greenhouse gas ready reductions, action-ready greenhouse gas reduction measures. And this element here, this first element, is the prerequisite for completion that you need to have in place in order to compete for those phase 2 implementation grants. The second one is the Comprehensive Climate Action Plan. This deliverable builds off of the first one and is due in the summer, fall. It's approximately 2 years from the date of your award. And that needs to expand upon the work you did in the Priority Climate Action Plan, include some greenhouse gas emission goals and targets, as well as strategies for implementing those, and go across all sectors of the emission spectrum. And then, like all grants, the final report is a closeout report. What did you do? How did you spend the dollars? And any updates on the planning process. And that's due 4 years from the date of award. So just in a little more detail, those elements in the Priority Climate Action Plan include an inventory, which is something that we already have underway for the 7-county metro area, and you'll be hearing more about in an upcoming meeting, I think in May or so, and has been an area of significant amount of work that our staff have been doing for the last couple of years, so we're excited to launch that. Quantified GHG measures are those actions that we can do that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and they're just wanting, basically, what are the things you can do? That authority to implement is an assessment of what all of the collaborating partners can actually do. We can always talk about, like, wouldn't it be great if, like, we all rode in, nuclear-fueled cars like the Jetsons or something, but that's not realistic. So we need to be picking actually things that we are actually all, as different agencies and local governments, have the authority to implement, and tie that to those quantified GHG measures. And then, as I mentioned previously, there's a focus on engagement with low-income and disadvantaged communities, and this particular element in the first plan is related to doing a broad benefits analysis. Are communities actually benefiting from the measures, or would they benefit from the measures that you are selecting as you're thinking about which measures that, you might be prioritizing for the Comprehensive Climate Action Plan, which you can see has additional elements here. It has all of those original 4 elements, plus projections of what you can expect over the longer term period of time. Your quantified measures must also go out over a longer period of time. And the plan should also include targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In addition, you'll see a hexagon on the upper left called leveraging federal funds. They want us to include a plan for how we would access all of those funds that are out there today to implement the measures that are identified, as well as a workforce analysis and whether we're prepared as a region to have the right employees, the right skills and the right job training in place in order to put these measures into place, or what we would need to do in order to be ready to do those things. So turning to, as I mentioned previously, our regional planning efforts, you've seen this from me before, but as you know, we're in the midst of doing our policy development in that lower right-hand area and doing the guide. And one of the elements in your draft vision that you endorsed earlier this year was leading on addressing climate change. and really ensuring that, that as staff that we're bringing actions to you that help to implement these items, even when you're not adopted and even while we're still working on developing this plan, we see this as an opportunity to help drive our engagement, especially with the funding that would be coming to us, to drive our engagement that can help be folded into our regional planning process, as well as build regional consensus about what's important to us as a region for implementing greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Of course, those are a lot of benefits and co-related actions or benefits that come along with greenhouse gas emissions reductions actions. And we certainly know that conversations around climate change and impacts and resilience in this region aren't limited to just one of those buckets, but they often are broad and expansive. So we really see this as an opportunity to learn quite a bit about what others are thinking about in this region, what's important to communities who are often the most burdened by climate impacts, and thinking about how, as a region, we can take collective action to make a difference and also improve the lives of those who are already overburdened by climate change. So some proposed findings for you is that staff, we find that there's broad alignment with climate policy work for the 2050 Regional Development Guide, that this grant opportunity aligns with existing efforts underway or completed, including some of those required elements I mentioned, the greenhouse gas emissions inventory and some of those quantified actions. We've done analysis on that work already. This gives us an opportunity to build on local climate action plans and really tie all of that great local work together, and that we have a strong connection with the state's climate action framework and the state's own grant efforts. Our staff are also members of those teams, so we see a lot of opportunity to leverage their additional resources to really make our work go further as well. We also find that this effort advances the sustainability outcome in Thrive MSP 2040, and it's also consistent with Council Policy FM 15-1, which requires us to come as staff to seek council authorization to apply for funds that exceed $500,000, and that provided that it's consistent with the council's mission and priorities. So proposed actions are that the council authorize Executive Director of the Community Development Division to develop and submit a notice of intent to participate as the lead agency, the grant application and related materials for the EPA's Climate Pollution Reduction Grants Program, and number 2, to negotiate and execute the cooperative agreement with the Environmental Protection Agency. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Questions? Mr. Lindstrom.
Thank you. The timing for this is perfect in terms of how it aligns with our regional plan, with only one exception in that I imagine it's going to take a fair amount of work to pull this off. Lots of coordination, as you already alluded to. Are we looking to get a little outside assistance on pulling this off?
Madam Chair, Mr. Councilmember Lindstrom, absolutely. I think that's the great thing about the planning grant is that additional $1 million. Well, we've done a lot of the analysis and data analysis already, and the state's done a significant amount of that work as well. We really see then that $1 million part of this grant as being a huge capacity boost for us to really, especially to help support additional engagement, coordination of meetings with local governments, and really add a lot of capacity to our already full work plans.
Mm-hmm.
Councilmember Carter.
Thank you. Just a comment, which originally would have been a question, but for the statement you just made, and that is that we're fortunate in that we are seeing a lot of work on the ground already in jurisdictions and their comprehensive plans. I'm glad you mentioned that. This effort to coordinate with the state and to leverage in regard to the work that is being done there is very important. And I think very, very important is that element of engagement, particularly with our community as well as local government partners around the work that they have and foresee, for which that coordination is extremely important. So I just wanted to earmark that you have just mentioned, that's a very big part of the planning grant and will be a part of, although I see the elements here, I didn't spell that out as well as you have just now, and I'm encouraged that we would have the opportunity for that engagement and for that joint planning. We've heard through comprehensive plans, and now that feedback and the ability to join voices and thoughts together in planning together will make such a big difference. So certainly in support of the planning grant and thankful to hear more about it today.
Council, thank you. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So back in about 2010, the council applied for a federal grant under the Obama administration for planning for the last round of comprehensive plans. And it makes me a little wary of the federal government bearing gifts, because the last time it was about equity and whatnot, and it required us to do those areas of concentrated poverty, which ended up making people really angry because it made parts of the region feel like they were being stigmatized as places where you don't want to develop and go and whatnot. So then we ended up having to rename everything and change our approach. So I'm a little nervous about what this might require us to do, and I think we need to be very careful not to do things that would make our region less competitive or that would raise the cost of energy or transportation or building, because those increased costs hit the people who can least afford it the worst. So with that caveat, I'm okay, but we need to be very, very careful about how we do it. I mean, even like you look at now, we've had how many years of Minneapolis saying people don't need a place to park their car at their home or apartment. They should just park on street or not have a car at all. Well, if you want to get an electric car, how do you do that if you can't plug it in at your house? I mean, we need to be mindful of what things we're doing that might make it harder to come here and be successful.
Other comments or questions? Councilmember Lee and then Councilmember Lindstrom.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, Lisa, thanks for this presentation. I want to commend you and the staff for wanting to do this. I think it's important work for us, and my only question is, assuming that as the state has applied as well, that the lead agency might be MPCA, and so my question is, how would we coordinate with them over some of these goals, or how do our plans roll up against each other, or if it might be redundant because we're both under the executive branch?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Lee, that's a really great question. There's actually two different funding opportunities. There's one for states and one for MSAs. And the EPA actually supports, I don't think they were expecting all of the states that did apply for that to go in, so they wanted to make funds available at different levels. So I think they said only 4 states and territories didn't apply out of the 54 that were eligible. So I think that a little bit surprised them. But at any rate, that, at states that are large, like ours, where our MSA is smaller than the state, and there are states where MSAs, that are larger than the state that they are housed within. But like states like ours, we definitely see a lot of coordination opportunities, and we also recognize that priorities that we might have in the 7-county metro might be different than what you might see, say, in northern Minnesota, where they're primarily forested, in those types of counties, for example. So we really see our opportunity, our MSA plan, as being a further articulation of the state's plan at a statewide level, and that there are that likely what we will see are prioritized actions that meet that might be more applicable for more rural counties, as opposed to in the metro there would be more, there might be different types of priority actions that we might be looking at, or different populations that we're looking at, and vice versa. But you're right, that there is a lot of overlap, and that's why we are working very closely with our counterparts at the state, and that they also are a part of our team as well. For the MSA plan, one of the 3 largest cities, the largest county, or a metro agency are eligible leads, and each metro area, each MSA must decide who their lead is, which is part of the reason that we're out meeting with folks too, is saying, so are we all okay? Does that sound like a good plan? Do you want to take the lead? Do you want us to take the lead? And working through that. So the state couldn't be the lead on the MSA plan, but they are a partner in the MSA plan.
Okay, thanks.
Councilmember Lindstrom.
Thank you. I'm sure you've already thought about this or have already done it, but you listed a lot of the groups that you've already reached out to. And I have a feeling that Shakopee, Mdewakanton Sioux is on the list or has already been connected with. I just wanted to make sure that they will be connected with.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Councilmember Lindstrom. One thing I didn't mention is that tribes are also eligible to apply on their own too. There's a separate pool of funds just for tribal governments, but certainly through the state plan as well as through the MSA plan, they could, like I said earlier, there's no wrong door, and you can actually be covered by multiple plans. But yes, they're on our upcoming list of folks to connect with.
Great.
I have what I think will be a quick question, Lisa, and that's the metropolitan statistic area. How often does CDC's work fit within that jurisdiction?
Madam Chair, we very rarely in community development do work outside of the 7-county metro.
So occasionally it's transportation, possibly environmental services from time to time, or not?
No.
Okay.
Transportation for sure.
Yeah.
We do from time to time review developments that are undergoing environmental review that are on our edge, but only as a commenter.
Okay.
But yeah, otherwise, no. Only with collaboration and partnership.
I was just curious. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just going to comment on that. I don't have to be as careful in my wording as staff does. Federal law requires us to work with a couple other counties on transportation things, but the counties around us usually freak out if anybody suggests us doing anything else outside of our 7-county metro area. They're very wary of that. It's kind of like talking about being in charge of water supply freaks everybody out. Even though we don't want to do that, just even saying it will drive people crazy. So it'll be interesting to see how much participation we get outside of the 7-county metro area, because they're always afraid that we're going to take them over.
Beware of the Met Council bearing gifts.
Yes.
So are there any more questions or comments? And if not, is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
And a second? Was there a second in there? Oh. Okay, Councilmember Dolokar, seconded. So we have a motion that the Metropolitan Council authorize the Executive Director of the Community Development Division to, 1, develop and submit a notice of intent to participate as the lead agency, a grant application, and related materials for the Environmental Protection Agency's Climate Pollution Reduction Grants Program, and 2, negotiate and execute the cooperative agreement with the Environmental Protection Agency. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carried. Thank you very much, Lisa. Next, we have Emmett Mullin. He's going to talk to us about the 2050 Regional Development Guide and Regional Parks Policy Plan Introduction and Overview.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Emmett Mullin, and I'm the Regional Parks Manager. And I'm here today to speak with you about the Regional Development Guide effort, and more specifically, the Regional Parks Policy Plan. I have about 10 minutes, and I'm going to try to hold myself to it, of presentation. Then I really hope to get into your questions and discussion and advice. the Regional Development Guide, and more specifically, the Regional Parks Policy Plan, we're really thinking a lot about integration and how the policy plan will fit within this larger umbrella effort. A big effort that I've heard from you is to improve how we better integrate how our council systems work together. And so that's going to be something that we're keeping an eye on, including our transit system, wastewater system, housing system, land use policies, and of course, the regional parks and trails system. So, did I do that wrong? Come on. There we go. Okay, so here are the topics I hope to cover today. We'll start by discussing a brief summary of the strategic framework for the Regional Development Guide. I'll share with you your council-endorsed regional values and vision within which we'll operate. And then I'll provide a little summary on the Parks Policy Plan and give you a sense for what we have been up to, and we have been up to a lot. I want to include a timeline for this process and our approach. And then, as I said earlier, we want to hear from you. We want to hear your questions and advice. So I think you've seen this graphic before, but as I understand it, and I was kind of laughing, this describes the basic framework, I don't know if this is a basic framework or not, of the Regional Development Guide and how it serves as an umbrella for our council's policy areas and system plans. You've done a really nice job creating a council-endorsed values and vision to frame our effort. Then there's this cross-cutting goals part of the Regional Development Guide, and I'm just mentioning that because I'm both super excited about it and a little perplexed by it, but that's that yellow area. And I think that's the point of sort of stepping down into that higher umbrella and then stepping into the system policies and plans. And this will be new to us, and I'll specifically say me. But I'm excited to talk about ideas for cross-cutting topics for these goals, including things like, I've heard accessibility and affordability. I've also thought a little bit about welcoming environment, that's something that crosses systems. We want to support and fortify that, as well as healthy natural systems. I was just listening to Lisa's presentation on the climate. I'm just like, it's pretty easy to integrate it into your vision and values, and I think the Parks Policy Plan is too. But then we have to drop into our individual policy plans because that is what helps guide our systems, so hopefully in a more integrative way. So here is the terminology. And again, the only one I'll point to, because you folks have seen this a few times, I'm guessing, is that the goals are really those desired outcomes. So I'm really excited to think more about that. So the core values, we call this the short form, but these are the regional core values. I know equity, leadership, accountability, and stewardship were not the sole things that you were talking about in this area. There were a lot of other values discussed, but these really emerged as the overarching themes and the most powerful ideas to date. So really excited about that. And then we have these 4 elements of our regional vision. And I'll spend just a minute here, but these regional vision statements are based on what emerged as cross-cutting issues. Like, I liked how you evolved that conversation, and that these themes are not the domain of any one policy area. Like, I think that's a super important concept. You'll see they don't get into any detail around policy areas at this level, but we will expect that policy development will further flesh out these concepts and articulate what they mean, and specifically when I say that, I mean to the regional park system, just because that's what I'm responsible for, we're responsible for. I see the parks, the regional parks and trail system in all 4 of these vision statements. It's pretty clear to me how important that regional parks and trail system is to our regional's quality of life. So when I saw these, I was really excited, thinking that it can help us move forward as a region. Now I'm stepping into the regional parks policy plan update. And for the next couple slides, that's what I'm going to focus on and where we are with this update. As some of you know, we're required to update the regional parks policy plan by state law. We have to do it at least once every 4 years. We last did it in December of 2020. That's when we had a system additions process, so we actually brought a number of new elements in our system. But this current effort is sort of this full-blown effort to update the entire regional development guide and policy plans. We, in the parks area, are planning significant internal and external engagement. We've already initiated several engagements with our Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission. Councilmember Vento, our liaison there, can talk about that. We've initiated a number of work groups with our regional parks implementing agencies, and we've started a small handful of targeted engagements with key communities. So it's really exciting. There is a lot going on, and this work will continue throughout this year and into 2024. So here's our project timeline. It's pretty basic. It's organized into 4 main project management phases: initiation, planning, execution, and close. We're transitioning from initiation and into the planning phase right now, so that's pretty exciting. We're moving. The initiation part included scoping the effort, reviewing existing conditions, and the start of the process to draft a vision and mission and values. We've also started drafting our engagement plan. This work is going to continue through spring. It is spring, not winter, and into early summer. So we're just getting into the planning phase, and I'm going to get into this more in greater detail. But we're rolling out a series of council, regional park implementing agencies work groups that will continue to meet into summer. Policy development will be a key aspect of this phase, of this work, and it will move into summer and even continue into next winter. So just getting it moving. And as I said earlier, the completion of the Regional Development Guide, as you know, and the Parks Policy Plan needs to be done by the end of next year. So that is the target. Over the next year, so I mentioned the first 2 of these work groups. Our proposal is to assemble at least 7 council implementing agencies working groups. So we've got the community engagement one moving, and we've also gotten this regional parks and trails system vision, mission, and values work group going. So that's really exciting. The other 5 work groups will ramp up later this spring or early summer. These work groups were intentionally formed around and directly connected to the major themes of input that we've received from the Regional Park Implementing Agencies and the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission. We did a little survey with them last fall, and we collected a lot of information. We're going to complement this approach with what is, I think, more traditional approach of reaching out to our partner agencies, but then also do some really targeted engagement with communities that don't have that history of participating in our parks planning processes. I'm jumping now into just a little update on the engagement work group. They met for the first time last week. Their goal is really the co-development of a transparent community stakeholder and public engagement plan for the regional parks policy plan update. We're coordinating this with the larger council effort, and we're working together with a number of people. Our second group that I mentioned earlier is the desire to develop kind of what I call a strategic front end to the regional parks policy plan that will sort of step down from that larger regional vision and values and create what we're thinking of as a vision, mission, and values for the regional park system. We want this to help. We want to do this early so it guides our policy development work. Council Park staff, as I said earlier, has been working a lot with our Parks and Open Space Commission and our agencies. Any regional park system, and I'm saying this because I believe it, is any vision that we create for the regional parks and trail system, it needs to align and nest within that larger regional development guide, vision and values, and also needs to go develop through a process that highlights our system's unique niche within the region and the contributions to the Twin Cities metropolitan area. This is my second to last slide, technically third to last, the thank you. Next steps, the council staff will continue working with the Parks and Open Space Commission, implementing agencies, and you as we move into this process. We are hoping to return to the Community Development Committee sometime in June or July to share our progress and maybe get into a little bit more detail. Several other work groups will be launched by this time, focused on areas identified earlier in this presentation. Our approach is that by next March, we're hoping to develop a 60% plan. That's what we're calling it, a 60% draft. And then by next July, we're going to go for a 90% parks policy plan that would then go out for review and comment. So that is the future as we know it today. And now we get to, I hope that was only 10 minutes. Thanks for listening. I know that was a lot. If you have any questions now, love to hear them. If you have any advice moving forward, happy to receive that too. Thank you.
Questions or advice? Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think in general, we've had a good, solid plan before. It's not like we're having to fix problems for the most part. But there is one thing that came up where people were calling me, I think it was last year, was some of these large regional parks in the rural areas that are trying to collect land. Nobody can go there yet because they don't have enough to actually have a park. I think we need to be really cognizant of the unique real estate challenges there are in those rural areas because land almost never comes up for sale. And if it does, you have to take it or you won't have the chance again for 60 years. But if we help the agencies get that land, having them turn it right away into natural prairie or something isn't realistic to do because that's very expensive and very time consuming to actually restore the natural areas. And sometimes the best way to keep invasive species out is, if it was farmland, continuing to farm it until you're ready to do the park. And we've, in the past, looked at that as, for a couple of years. But when you're on a really, really long timeline to put all of the parcels together, farming it to keep the invasive species out I think we need to consider to do that longer and not say that's not a park use, because it is. It's preserving the land so that you can do something with it later, rather than letting it be taken over with a bunch of invasive species because you're not on the land maintaining it. That's just the one thought that came to me.
Good point. I'm on a board for a nonprofit that acquired some farmland and helped with that transition to a natural prairie. And you're right about the amount of time it takes, and you don't want to make things worse in your timeline by default. Make it more of a challenge and more of an expensive challenge. So you're right. Councilmember Wolf.
Well, and furthermore, Madam Chair, a lot of those agencies on the edges that are acquiring those large parcels are very small regional park agencies and get almost no money from us. So saying you have to spend a ton of money to change this over right now, or you can't buy the property, is sort of self-defeating because they don't have the money.
Right. Well, to the extent that we can help those agencies partner with nonprofits that do this kind of work, it would be really beneficial too, really beneficial. Other comments or questions?
Thank you.
If you think of them, you know, a lot of times my brilliant thoughts come late at night or when I'm out walking my four-legged roommate. And we don't use the word walk in my house because that word and the word treat really cause quite a commotion. But let Emmett know, at the last MPOSC meeting, we had quite a discussion around all of this, and it was great. The staff rolled up their sleeves along with the MPOSC members, and if you'd walked into the room, you wouldn't have known which one was a staffer and which one was an appointee, and it was fun. So, Councilmember Lindstrom.
Thank you. Are you putting together that targeted list of groups to reach out to now, or is it kind of a rolling thing, or is that already set? But go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Chair and Councilmember Lindstrom. We are putting it together. It's a rolling list, I think of. We've already been out and met with a number of small groups and agencies, and we are, so it's a process that is evolving as we go forward. I'll mention, because it's kind of interesting, we are conducting a historical cultural study of the regional parks and trails system. It's a really big deal, and it's hard and slow work. And we'll come and talk to you about it someday soon. Through that process, we're working with a consultant that's helping us reach out to new communities, and it's going well. And did I mention it's hard? So so I will just mention that I'm really excited about it, and we are really committed to using our learnings from this process as we move into the policy development of this plan, and we think that'll be really important to share back with you folks as we move forward. So thanks for the question.
Absolutely.
Anyone else? Thank you very much, Emmett.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Our last item tonight is scenarios planning and land use analysis. Angela Torres and, all right, I'm going to mess this up, but Baris Gumus Dawes. Is that close?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
I've had a lot of variations on my name.
I bet. As a former elementary teacher, one of my goals was always to make sure that I pronounced students' names correctly, because, you know, it's who we are, and sometimes it's a little hard when people are constantly struggling, so thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair and committee members. As you may know, I'm Angela Torres, Senior Manager of Local Planning Assistance, and with me is Dr. Baris Gumus Dawes, Planning Analyst for Research. So we're here to build on several of our previous conversations talking about scenario planning and land use policy. Thanks. I'm going to just really briefly recap a few of our previous conversations to set the context for how we're working with scenario planning as part of the land use policy development process and some of the explorations that we're working through right now. Baris will kind of round out the initial conversation that Joel Hudding, the manager of research, shared with you at the last CDC meeting, which will include what it looks like to apply scenario planning with land use metrics and the implications of what that might look like in the context of land use policy explorations. You're going to get used to seeing this graphic quite a lot. We like it. At the March 20th CDC meeting, I was here to kind of open up the land use policy discussion where we looked back on the council's role in planning for growth and development in the region and how we've been preparing for that for over 2 years to provide a foundation of information and research as we prepare for policy development in 2023 and 2024. This is more of that foundation building, what you'll hear from Baris today. We also talked about the work the council has already accomplished in identifying a working set of values and identifying 4 cross-cutting regional issues, as well as working vision statements, which will be refined and built on throughout the year as the engagement continues. We talked about the planning approach of centering equity, climate change, healthy communities, and natural systems protection in our policy conversations. And just a reminder, we will regularly ask you to consider the question, what will it take to achieve the regional vision? So we will always be circling back to those values and visions that you worked on throughout last year. In the land use policy work, we're using scenario planning as a tool to explore the vision and its intersection with regional land use policy. A data-centered scenario tool paired with a broad exploratory method of analysis kind of makes both researchers and planners happy. So it's an amalgamation of us both. So with that, Baris is here today to talk more about scenario planning, and I will let her take it from here.
So my name is Baris Dawes. Good afternoon, and I am a planning analyst at the Community Development Division. I also lead the council's scenario planning efforts. So 2 weeks ago, Joel Hudding gave you a brief introduction to scenario planning, and today I will go into a little bit more detail and describe to you what exactly scenario planning is and why and how we are working on it. So let me just start by talking a little bit about scenario planning. Scenario planning is slightly different than the traditional planning methods that we use. In this case, we look at the future and try to accommodate the uncertainties associated with it. And in traditional planning, we tend to look at the past trends and try to sort of project them into the future. And as a result of that, we try to orient our policies toward that picture and try to deal with that future by looking at our set of policies available to us. In scenario planning, we just start looking at the future instead and analyze the ways it could pan out in ways that we do not anticipate. So as a result of that, we use a planning technique to prepare for the future contingencies and to help figure out a future that might be complicated. So we start by looking at some of the opportunities and challenges that are associated with the potential futures, and by identifying them, we're trying to prepare for these future contingencies. And we try to identify and explore these opportunities and challenges by to orient our policies towards solving these, address the issues, either the challenges or the opportunities. So there are 2 pieces of uncertainty that we deal with when we're talking about regional growth issues. And those are where we're going to grow and how much we're going to grow. The council needs to know where we need to put our services and infrastructure investments And we need to know how many people are going to be there that we're going to serve, and where exactly they would be living. So to start the process of thinking about different regional growth scenarios, we just think about different aspects of growth, and we create scenarios where we're experiencing different regional growth patterns. So the first thing that we looked at when we tried to understand these different growth patterns that could come up in the future is we came up with a business as usual scenario. The business as usual scenario is what happens if we looked at the past decade and if that was projected into the future. And everything else, we use the business as usual scenario as a bit of a baseline, and we would like everything else, all the other scenarios that we're considering with those particular, with that particular scenario. So we asked the question, what if the region grows more than the business as usual scenario? We asked, what if it grows less than the business as usual scenario? And then we look at the locational aspect or the spatial distribution of growth in the region. And we ask, what if we grow in a more compact way in the already developed areas of the region? Or what if we develop in the lesser developed and lower density areas that are in the suburban and rural areas? What if the growth is dispersed into those areas? So those are the two pieces, and when we put those pieces together, we come up with the 4 scenarios that you see on the chart, or I should say 5. Business as usual is in there as well. And so we're looking at a higher growth, more compact, lower growth, more compact, higher growth, more dispersed, and lower growth, more dispersed. So I want to get into the details a little bit of what I mean when I say high growth, low growth. When we look at higher population growth, we're looking at 50% higher than the business as usual scenario. And when we look at lower population growth, it's around 25% less than the business as usual scenario. When we look at employment, we're looking at 50% higher than the business as usual scenario for the higher growth case, and 50% less than for the lower employment growth scenario. I should say that these numbers are, this is a hypothetical exercise, so these numbers are a bit arbitrary, and but we chose these numbers specifically because we wanted the scenarios to be significantly different for each scenario. So they have to be, we need to push the numbers a little bit to make the landscape look different. But we also wanted them to be plausible. So the 25% looks a little less than the 50% that we bumped up, and that's because our forecasters and our demographers told us that it is less likely that we're going to get growth that is less than, or that's 50% less than the business as usual. So we capped it at 25%. And the employment numbers, those just are serendipitous. The 50-50 worked out because we don't actually distribute employment. We just use our land use model to distribute population. And the 2 models are connected to each other, our regional forecast model. So when we have the population numbers fed into our forecast model, it spits out employment numbers. So that's why we got the 50-50%. So it was auspicious that they lined up like that. We didn't choose them. So in terms of the location of growth, in this case, we had our modelers basically divided growth into 3 sections. We are just looking at different spatial locations within the region, and we just divided into an urban area, or an urban section, a suburban section, and a rural section. And all of these sections are agglomerations of specific community designations. So when we say urban, we're including urban centers as well as urban areas. When we say suburban, it's a combination of suburban areas, suburban edge, and emerging suburban areas. And when we say rural, we're including agricultural along with rural areas. And when we look at the compact case, you will see that if most of the region's growth is tilted toward the urban areas, then we consider that a compact growth pattern. If we look at the dispersed pattern, most of the region's growth is tilted toward the suburban areas. And you can see that on the chart. The middle bar is our business as usual, and you can see that the blue and the orange parts, the orange part is the suburban and the blue part is the urban area. You can see that the blue and the orange are relatively balanced. So we have a regional growth pattern that is actually neither too compact nor too dispersed. And in the compact model, as you can see, compared to, if you look at the first bar compared to the second one, we see that the blue portion of the first bar is larger than the blue portion of the second bar. And when you look at the third one, which is the dispersed, the orange part is larger than the business as usual orange part because it's tilting toward the suburban areas of the region. So I just talked in abstract about these models or these scenarios, and now I'd like to show you what it looks like on the ground. So we just put together 5 maps, and all of these maps they represent a scenario. So the one on the top left is our business as usual scenario, and these are population maps. So they show us the increase in population from 2020 to 2050. And if you look at the colors, it's meant to be green. I don't know if you see it as green, but the darker the green is, the darker an area is, the higher the population growth in that area. So the darker green areas that you see are areas where the region is going to be experiencing a lot of regional growth. And as you look at the business as usual scenario, we have a lot of growth in the region's core areas, which includes not only Minneapolis and St. Paul, but the first-ring suburbs surrounding them. And so the development pattern is fairly balanced. You see development in the suburban areas as well as the region's core and some in the rural and agricultural areas. So when we look at the higher growth, more compact scenario, which is the top middle map, you will see that compared to the business as usual scenario, we have a more compact or a color palette which is more dense and darker in the core, and it is less so around the suburban areas. And when you compare that with the higher growth and dispersed scenario, you can see that the region's core is fairly light colored. So we're not really getting much development as much growth in the region's core, but we're having more of a growth pattern around the region's core. It's kind of like a donut pattern. And that's, when we see maps like that, we're kind of happy. The pattern is easy to see, and you can call it donuts, so it's pretty good. So moving back to the bottom of the slide, there are the lower growth and more compact and lower growth and more dispersed maps. Those are very similar to the ones that are above them. It's just that the maps are a little lighter shade because we don't get enough or as much growth. So these charts are representations of the maps that you have seen. The business as usual scenario is up in the top. They're not very different than the maps that the chart that I showed you before. You can see the high compact growth case. You have the urban areas, that's the second bar. The blue areas are larger, relatively larger than the orange areas. That's where the population is growing. When you look at the high dispersed, you can see that majority of the population growth is taking place in the suburban areas. So the orange section is fairly large, and that's the case for both the third bar and the fifth bar, which is the low dispersed growth, basically. And now we have another set of maps, and these are the employment maps. They are showing the change in employment from 2020 to 2050. And again, we have a business as usual map on the top left corner. And the business as usual map is a little different than the population map. Employment has a very distinct footprint, and it has a very unique spatial pattern. It tends to concentrate across highways, railways, and areas that have easy access to highways. So you see a pattern which is fairly unique. If I had the overlay of highways in here, or the transportation network, you would have easily seen the correspondence. And when you look at the high growth, more compact map, you see exactly the same footprint, a very similar footprint. It's just that it's a bit darker along the highway corridors. And when you look at the dispersed one, that's also, you wouldn't expect a very identical or a very similar map because it's a dispersed pattern, but there's almost no difference between the compact, the one in the middle, and the one on the right-hand side on the top. Very little difference, and that tells you that employment in our region is pretty much, it has an inertia in its footprint. So employment centers tend to, they tend not to change a lot. Historically, that has been the case for decades now. We're having employment centers which are in the same spots. So even when the population is getting more suburbanized, employment is not suburbanizing as much. And you'll see that in the charts that I'll show to you too. So that has implications for the future. And one of the reasons why we have a sort of an inertia is because businesses tend to cluster in places where they tend to work with other businesses that serve them. So there are sort of like there's an ecology of businesses that they kind of cluster together when they work together. Another reason is because we are using the 2040 transportation network in this map, and it's going to be going all the way to 2050. And since we're only using the same transportation network, employment locations are not changing. If there were significant changes in the transportation network, we might have seen significant changes in the employment centers.
Barajas, Councilmember Wolf has a question.
Oh, sure. I'm so sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. How much of that inertia is related to the way that we map where people are working when we have the change in people working from home?
You got my next line.
All right, then I'll shut up and let you go to the next line.
That's a great question. Indeed, we map jobs in the headquarters, even if people are working elsewhere. And that is an artifact of this data set. There is some built-in inertia to it. But I should say that even in a telework scenario, which is our high growth dispersed scenario, actually incorporates a telework situation, even in that scenario, we see an inertia. So clearly, when we incorporate telework, it's consistent with that inertia as well. So it's a fraction of the jobs that are impacting our overall employment pool is a fraction of them are teleworking, basically. So going back to the bottom two maps, as you will see, they are very similar to the other three maps. And it's just they're lighter shade, and the employment centers are not as deep or as rich in color. So this chart is just like the other chart that you have seen. The main point in here is if you look at the second and the third bars, the difference in the urban parts of the of regional growth, the blue parts, they're not that different. So it just tells you that when we go from a compact scenario to a dispersed scenario, there is not that many more jobs suburbanizing. So there is that discrepancy between, you will see, actually, I should show you that. I'm afraid the charts are a bit small. If you look at the charts, the second and the third bar of the charts, you'll see that when you look at the population side, the second bar, the blue part of the second bar, is fairly larger than the blue part of the third one, which is the dispersed one. So that means that when we look at move from a compact scenario to a dispersed one, lots of people are suburbanizing. So the regional component of suburbanization is pretty high. When you look at employment, the blue portion of the second bar compared to the third one, it doesn't drop as dramatically. That means jobs are not suburbanizing as much. It's consistent with that inertia in the footprint. Before I go into exploring the implications of this, I want to remind you a little bit of how our models work, and Joel talked about it last time he was here. I just want to briefly remind you so that you can understand how we got to the land use results piece. As I mentioned, we have a regional economic model and a demographic model, and this is the model that produces our forecasts. And so we get the regional population and job numbers from this model, and then we feed those numbers into our land use model, which actually distributes all those numbers by jurisdiction. And so we run this model that we already use for our local forecasts 5 times by feeding the numbers that I talked to you about, high growth, low growth numbers, and the compact dispersed. We run it 5 times, and we come up with the 5 scenarios which have local distributions of population and employment associated with them. So, and they have land use implications, and results that come out of them are important. And I will discuss with you some of those land use results today. So, 3 things were of particular importance to our land use analysis, and I would encourage you to think of others if you have any in mind. We would like to get that feedback from you. But for now, we came up with 3 land use metrics because they are important to some of our policies. So we started by looking at land consumed, and the measure of that is the total acres of land developed. And we wanted to look at density of land use, and for that we looked at average acres of land used per household. And usually when we have a high number for that, high acres per household used, that means we're in a less dense situation. So there is an inverse relationship. The higher the number for average acres, the lower the density. And then for agricultural land developed, that was another piece of land use. We looked at the total acres of agricultural land used to lost to development. So what did we find? I just pulled 2 of our metrics next to each other because they have a bearing on each other. So I want to show you some of the findings that we have. When you look at the chart on the right, the total acres of additional land, we are, I'm having a hard time reading the bottom of the maps, but I believe the tallest bar, maybe I should just take a look at that, thank you.
Give that back later, please.
So if you look at the high dispersed scenario, which is the tallest one, so we're just seeing a situation where when growth is really high and it's really dispersed, we have a situation where we're consuming the highest amount of acres in our region. And similarly, when you look at the low dispersed scenario, compared to its low compact counterpart, it is consuming more land. In fact, this is the case for both high growth and low growth scenario. We have however much we grow, when we grow in a dispersed fashion, we're consuming more land. And if you compare the business as usual scenario, which is the 3rd column, with the first one, then you'll see that we are consuming roughly the same amount of acreage when we are in a high compact scenario as we are in a business as usual scenario. So that's kind of, it tells you that when we have almost 500,000 more people in the region, we're still consuming the same amount of land because we're doing it in a compact way. So that means we're consuming land more efficiently, or in a sort of, we're keeping the footprint smaller than the dispersed footprint. And as a result, we're having more density. We're consuming land more densely. And this is consistent with the map or the chart you see on the right-hand side. In that case, when you look at the high compact scenario, we're consuming land at a rate of 0.25. And when you compare that with business as usual, that's 0.31, which means in the high compact case, we are consuming land more densely. And when you look at the low dispersed, it has the highest or the lowest density consumption of land. So our next finding is about agricultural land. So when we look at agricultural land consumption, you see that the high compact and low dispersed scenarios are consuming agricultural land at the same rate. So this is the first chart, first bar in the chart with the fifth one in the chart. So we're consuming around 52,000 acres of land, but in one case, in the dispersed case, we have 250,000 households consuming that much land. When you look at the high compact case, the first bar in the chart, we're actually having 500,000 people consuming the same amount of agricultural land. So twice the population taking same amount of land. So in that sense, if we grow in a compact fashion, we're developing a lot less land, agricultural land, and we're losing a lot less agricultural acres. So, and that has implications from the point of view of our vision components and values, basically.
Madam Chair? Yes. While we're on this slide, so I remember that you said that there was almost no business development out in the rural areas, but there's been an accelerating trend of taking land out of ag use and turning it into solar farms. It would be interesting to look at the impact of lost agricultural land due to solar farms compared to the magnitude of development, because I just heard about a proposed solar farm that would be 2,000 acres, which is pretty substantial compared to those numbers there. And that's one of those intersections of the different things that the council is doing, because if you take good ag land out of production for solar farms, it can have a major impact. That was a big change that we saw in the last round of comp plans, is how much land was being lost to solar farms.
Good question. Councilmember Lindstrom.
Thank you. I'm wondering if in your modeling do you also model out the impacts on vehicle miles traveled in the region?
Yes, we do. And I don't have that presentation today, but to our transportation committee, we just actually had some numbers, and compact development under each growth scenario, regardless of how much we grow, tends to create less VMT per capita.
Thank you. That's what I would suspect. Yeah.
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 Yeah, some of these findings you will see, to planners, they are, duh moments. They just get it, To lay people, sometimes it's not quite obvious. So I think it's important to state that in their context. But our data shows that these findings are fairly clear. So just to summarize the findings we have, compact development uses land more efficiently and more intensely. So if we want to use our land in an economical fashion, as it's stated in our statute, compact development favors that kind of land consumption. And in terms of agricultural land, dispersed development puts pressure on agricultural land. So what is the relation of the findings to our regional values and vision? And Emmett mentioned some of them. I have here as the columns the 4 vision components that the council recently endorsed. And I'm just trying to establish how we can talk about these metrics. What do they do for us? What they do for us is that they measure the role land use plays in achieving larger regional goals. And in this case, we're just trying to connect how each measure relates to each vision component. So the check marks that you see on these tables correspond to, relate one metric to a vision component. So if you take, for instance, the total acres of land use, land developed metric, and connect it with the natural systems protected and restored, then we can talk, for instance, about a regional growth pattern that uses a lot of land, undermines our regional goal of achieving, protecting the natural systems, because there is not an infinite amount of land in the region, and if we keep our growth footprint small, then it becomes easier for us to protect our natural systems. And I think on that note, I will turn it over to Angela. Sorry for stealing your notes.
Yeah. Totally fine. That's why we're partners, right? Okay.
I want that chart.
So we do know that land use policies have a tremendous impact on the things that we care about. Brish kind of explained a lot of those connections. And as the council forecasts how much growth we're expecting in the region through 2050, land use policies set expectations on where that growth will go, at what intensity that growth will be, and how growth and development is supported through infrastructure investments and other incentives that the council offers. Knowing that land use policies have a great impact on the things that we care about, we have to consider how land use policies can move the region toward desirable outcomes and away from undesirable ones. We've planned a series of conversations here at the CDC in the upcoming meetings with you. Each will include cross-cutting regional issues and some analysis around that. We will look at the intersections of land use and other policy areas. Councilmember Lindstrom questioned, kind of stole the thunder on the transportation and land use one, but that's okay. We've got other findings with that one as well. And we'll start talking about council goals for land use, which will move us into policy development. You've also seen this many times. I mentioned the cross-cutting issues several times. The analysis we will be bringing at the next meeting will evaluate opportunities and challenges associated with the 4 cross-cutting issues for each of the 4 scenarios. And as a sneak peek, these are the high-level themes that emerged out of the opportunities and challenges analysis. We've identified opportunities and challenges associated with each scenario under each cross-cutting issue in order to better inform future policies. At the next CDC meeting, the team analyzing this, which includes Barish, will go in depth in each of these areas and seek feedback on those findings. And with that, that's the end of our presentation. But on this question slide, I do want to say that Emmett had some very great questions, and I'm just going to steal a couple of them. So questions about what you've heard so far, of course, we're here and happy to answer any questions like that. But if you have any policy level guidance or advice to share with council staff as we're doing some of this analysis and on the various work teams that are underway, please let us know what those suggestions might be as well. Thank you.
Questions or comments? Councilmember Carter and then Councilmember Dalkar.
The substance of the presentation was just very, very informative, and I want to appreciate all that's gone into the development of this information. I also noticed I didn't have it here on my
Yeah, it's not
iPad,
linked to the agenda.
and so I want to ask for it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Very, very much appreciate being able to go back and look through.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
Good request. Councilmember Dalkar.
Thank you, Chair. This is an educational question for me. So for the land use planning, does the council provide how to do more dense development to local counties and government?
Chair and Councilmember Dalkar.
Question.
The council provides general guidance based on community designations. So communities are grouped with other like communities, and density expectations are set for those community designations. For example, in Thrive MSP 2040, suburban communities were expected to develop at a minimum of 5 units per acre. Some of the other more urbanized communities were expected to develop at much higher densities. And then we also provide guidance around transit-oriented development, so where we're particularly investing regional infrastructure, we have different and higher expectations for density in those areas as well.
Can I keep going? And so when you have guidance like that, do we often meet the guidance, in terms of like transit-oriented development? Like, do we meet what our potential is for denser community? Hold on.
Chair and Councilmember Dolkar, we always plan for those minimum densities, and communities do that through their local comprehensive plans, which the council authorizes local governments to put into effect. We do track on an annual basis through programs like plat monitoring and some others, how development is actually occurring in the region. And what we do find is that on average, most communities are planning at just above that, and those plans are coming to fruition. So the growth actually does generally come in a little bit higher than the minimum, if I remember correctly. We'll have some more presentations on that in the coming months as well.
Thank
for
you.
this last year.
Yes.
This is still educational because I'm new and I'm trying to understand this. So, the question that Emmett had that you wanted to ask us, that's the question I'm sitting with is, as a council body, what would be policy, like what would be the new edge, innovative policy that you would think that we would need to advance to sort of meet the mission? And I no longer know if it's 2040 or 2050 since we're also planning for 2050. So I'm thinking around climate, I'm thinking about transportation, affordable housing, like what would be the new things that we should start thinking about as a council member?
Chair and Councilmember Dolkar, thank you for those questions. Those are some of the questions that we will be posing with almost like a menu of options. So depending on how far the council members want to go and how far the different things the council members want to consider, there's lots of different things that we can do. Throughout the years, I was here and presenting on the MUSA implementation guidelines, for example. And throughout the years, the MUSA implementation has been sometimes very constrained, sometimes very flexible. And so those are different policy decisions that the council has made over time. And so if we want to have a more compact development pattern, perhaps the MUSA is constrained to the 2040 MUSA, which actually with Todd's presentation a couple of weeks ago and the growth that we're expecting might be something that we would do anyway. And so those are just policy considerations that we'll bring forward for you to consider. As we dig in deeper, you'll see some of that with the next presentation on the opportunities and challenges. And I think where you'll see that sometimes things are in conflict and sometimes you have to plan for mitigation. If we do want a more compact development pattern, we may have something else where we'll have to mitigate some of those services, for example. And so those are just ongoing policy conversations that you'll be asked over time as we get into it. This is really early on. I don't want to kind of advise on any policies just yet. There's lots of things under consideration, but you guys will be the ones that hear that and make those decisions for the region.
Okay, thank you.
Good questions, thank you. Anyone else? Barish and Angela, thank you both very much. This was an excellent presentation.
Thank you so much.
And anything else for the good of the cause? Lisa, do you have anything to report?
No other reports.
Well, we survived a meeting without Chair Lilligren, so thank you all. Have a good evening, and I'd say go out and enjoy this gorgeous weather, but too late.
It's sunny. It's sunny.
Yeah, it's sunny, that's right, and
Not
it's gonna get
gorgeous.
warmer.
It's not gorgeous.
It's gonna get it's gonna get better. Thank you all.
I went to the.
This meeting is adjourned.
I-35